Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the United States suspending funding to the World Health Organization. Donald Trump has instructed his administration to suspend funding to the international global health body. He said the WHO has failed in its basic duty in response to the coronavirus and has therefore suspended that body's fees and dues at this point in time, at least the portion that the United States pays towards that global health body at this point in time. Global reactions have been, as expected, negative to this decision of Donald Trump, saying that this is certainly not the time to be defunding the WHO, especially right in the middle of the pandemic. That's not to say, of course, that there is not legitimate criticism of the WHO at this point in time about how it may have handled this coronavirus from day one, whether it should have enacted and told of the issue a lot earlier on than it did possibly. Donald Trump says it's China-centric. Is that true or not? Does that even matter right at this point in time? Certainly those things can be reviewed after the fact, can it not? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Calvin Dark, who is a principal and co-founder of RC Communications. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is Mary Andes, who's a master's in global health and public policy from the University of Edinburgh. She's also worked in global health for the BBC and at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Mary and Calvin, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Mary, let me start with you. What do you make of Donald Trump's decision?
Really irresponsible to begin with. I mean, like you said, surely there are problems with WHO that he can work on, but now is not the time. He even said that this could take 60 to 90 days, probably longer, and real lives will be lost during that time. I mean, he's trying to use the WHO, frankly, as a scapegoat for Trump's own mistakes, and it doesn't check out. If you look at how they treated it so far, like I said, I agree, there were mistakes made, but it just, in every way, they've done things that it has neglected to, and to cut the funding now is just completely horrible, completely irresponsible, both for the U.S. and the world.
Calvin, do you also think that Donald Trump is looking for a scapegoat? That's certainly an argument that many people are using at this time.
Yes, I think he's looking for somewhere to shift the blame. And like many people have said, there is legitimate criticisms that can be made, although stopping the funding now in the middle of the pandemic is probably not the smartest, regardless of where the blame lies. But one of the things that I just want to remind everybody about is one thing about Donald Trump is what he does is unorthodox, but it's not surprising. From the very beginning of his campaign, he's railed against international bodies, world cooperation, for one reason, is he has made a claim that for administrations, not just the past one, but administrations before that, that the world is taking the U.S.'s money and using it outside of the U.S.'s interest. Now, of course, a lot of that is completely untrue and completely mischaracterized, but this fits exactly in line. And this is why he did this. Will this have a practical effect other than the confidence in the WHO in the next few days and weeks? Probably not. But this does allow the people that support him to be reminded that he said he was going to put America first.
Okay, so do you think this is genuinely putting America first? Because how does America benefit if the WHO loses funding, then loses, by default, really, its ability to be able to function in many places around the world, because the U.S. is, whether we like it or not, a major contributor to the WHO, as in other international bodies of the like as well. That sounds like it's almost like the American president is hitting himself over the head with a hammer.
The U.S. undoubtedly is a huge funder to WHO, and that money will be missed. The deaths might not come soon, in a few weeks, few months, but the WHO does so many things that ultimately keep the U.S. and the world safe. And to try and separate the two just doesn't work out the way Trump wants it to. I mean, there's a continuing Ebola epidemic in the Congo right now, and the WHO is part of that line to stop that from coming to the United States, to protect the rest of the world. And you're right that it is on Trump's brand to something that helps people internationally, but ultimately this hurts America as well as everyone else.
So then what happens next, do you think? This is a suspension at this point in time, as we know. The administration has said that it will now be reviewing the WHO and its activities at this point. Will the U.S., as it has with other international organizations, we can talk about UNESCO, for example, will it make the decision to walk away? That's quite drastic, is it not?
Yes, to completely walk away is drastic, and In typical Donald Trump fashion, you notice there's always the show and the move, but it's not always followed up. Because for him, if it is a political move, he gets his political points with making the announcement. And because in this area where, yes, there's always politics involved, no matter what the issue, but with World Health, and particularly the people on Donald Trump's health task force, they understand more than I do the great impact that the WHO has. So I think when it comes down to it, we won't do exactly as Donald Trump said we would do, but I do think that it's going to decrease the confidence that the U.S. citizens have in the WHO. But in the end, I don't think he'll go through with it, but he will continue to say that he did so that he then presents the image of letting the world not take advantage of the U.S. anymore. And I just want to add one other thing, too, is that he missed a really big opportunity when he did this. Instead of pulling the funding, he could have showed leadership and said, we have issues with X, Y, and Z. So we want to work with you to reform. And if those reforms are not heeded, then let's talk about funding. But he went straight to take away the money, which made great political points, but doesn't actually help the WHO, the world, or the United States.
Indeed. Mary, I also feel like this is a lost opportunity, is it not? Because it's not like the U.S. is doing great at this point in time vis-a-vis its respective coronavirus pandemic and outbreak, right? I mean, we know that there's shortages of the most basic equipment for doctors and nurses across that country at this point in time. Wouldn't it have been smarter at this point in time to actually put a hand forward to the rest of the world and say, listen, we need you, you need us, let's work together?
I think that would have been absolutely great. I think honestly that Trump is incapable of doing something like that. I think that he is, as Calvin said, he's trying very hard to please his base and to separate the United States from any bigger organization. And I think this could have been a real chance. It could have been a real sign to the rest of the world that even while the U.S. is struggling within our borders to respond to COVID-19, we're not alone. We're not the only country dealing with this. It was a real opportunity to make some connections and kind of get some that I think Trump, needs to get internationally. But as usual, he kind of went for the easy fix. And I want to comment on what Calvin said before. He's completely right that Trump says one thing that often sounds very dramatic and does not always follow through. He has a bit of a buffer with Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci, who are both on the task force, in that a couple of times already, Trump will make some kind of dramatic statement, and then over the next few days, press releases will be sent out, and it's kind of softened because of these people. So I agree that this does not necessarily mean the United States will completely cut funding to WHO, but I do think it's very worrying, and it just shows where Trump's head is.
Indeed. I wanted you, Mary, because it's interesting the way Donald Trump has acted vis-a-vis foreign policies when it comes to this entire pandemic, right? I mean, he's done things which defy logic vis-a-vis blocking masks being delivered to Canada, for example. I mean, Canada is a next-door neighbor, literally, and there are no issues, to the best of my knowledge, between the Canadians and the Americans at this point in time on an official basis. So why block those sort of masks? He's gone after the Europeans. He's done some really interesting, odd things throughout this time. Do you think that post-coronavirus, post-COVID-19, that the world will almost learn the lessons of how the United States has acted at this point in time and possibly take heed of that?
That's a very good question. I think that that's chance. I think that right now Trump feels backed into a corner, and all the kind of crazy actions we're seeing, like the ones you mentioned, fighting with Canada, the problems in our own country, I think a lot of those are basically just a PR stunt to get Trump out of this kind of mess he finds himself in. And I do not, that's a very horrible thing to call COVID-19, this whole situation. I think that he just doesn't know what to do. I think that he could reach out to leaders, as this is a great time to work with the rest of the world to fight this. But instead, we're basically fighting with ourselves within our own border. And it's wasting time. It's wasting resources that could be used within the United States and in other countries. And I don't know how the U.S. is going to come out of this. I don't know how we could come out looking like the leader in global health when we're making such mistakes within our borders and we're alienating everyone else outside our borders. I don't know what it will look like in the global health world post-COVID-19, and I'm not sure what the United States' role will be.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, do you think it was always Trump's plan to sort of have the U.S. take a step back from this global leadership role, be it in health or culture or otherwise, really? Because that seems to be the Trump playbook, doesn't it? And I mean, for many people around the world, that may make sense where the U.S. has had this leadership role, this policeman of the world. Maybe it is time for the U.S. to give that up?
No, I think it's a little bit more nuanced with Donald Trump. I think he wants to be seen as the world's leader. Every press conference, every statement he gives emphasizes that the U.S. has the most powerful economy. It used to be in the world. Now it's in the history of the world, which that's a whole nother math question we'd have to debate. The most powerful military in the world, the smartest people. And there's nothing wrong with promoting America. I'm American. I promote it, and he's the president of the United States. So there's no surprise that he does that. So he doesn't want to not be the leader in the world. He wants to be seen as someone that finally steps in and says, we've been the leader and we've been paying for everybody else not paying their fair share. That's why you don't have some of the things that you want, what he would say, speaking to his base here in the United States. So he does want to be seen as the world leader, the most important person, but he wants to be seen as cleaning up a system that, I will quote right before the election, only I can fix it. And I think that is the mentality behind what President Trump is doing.
Also, let's talk about consequences then, Mary, because as I spoke about earlier as well with you, the U.S. is a major contributor to the WHO, as are other countries, certainly. What kind of an effect will this have, do you think, especially on those countries which really genuinely rely on the WHO, developing countries, for example?
Have its results in developing countries. I mean, the sad thing about this is if our funding is truly cut to the WHO, the U.S. is not most at risk. And the countries that rely heavily on the programs of WHO and rely on them for basic health systems in some countries. I mean, the WHO works on pandemics and international health emergencies, but they do everything more on a daily basis. They work on diarrhea and respiratory infections that kill children. They work on safe births and giving pre and postnatal care to mothers, medical and health education all over the world. They work against malaria, the Ebola Congo epidemic, as I mentioned. I mean, there are people that rely on that money directly. And like you said, the people who will suffer will be those people in developing countries who need that assistance, who need those malaria nets, who needs that health education, who needs that visit with their doctor when they're 3 months pregnant. These are the people who are going to miss out. And I don't think Trump, honestly, I don't think he considers them. I'm not even sure it's, but like you said, it's wanting to look the best, wanting to please his base. And I don't know if he doesn't know, I'm sure he does, what these results will be, but I'm not sure he thinks it that far.
Because, there's also an argument to be made about soft power, right? One argument can be made that the U.S. has a humanitarian, a moral reason for helping out the rest of the world, really, even at this point in time, or just the WHO in general, or other such international organizations. But then there's also the argument to be made that it just looks good on the U.S. to be doing this, and it increases its soft power around the world in many people's minds. Do you think that's something that Donald Trump genuinely does not care about at this point? I mean, does he genuinely care about his country's image in that regard, not just in the regard where you have, a PR stunt? This is less so in your face.
Well, I think what you just described, the soft power influence that the U.S. has had and can continue to have, I do think Donald Trump's aware of it, but it doesn't make him look strong. It makes him look like we are continuing to pick up the slack from the rest of the world. But now, one thing I don't think he understands, and I really wish that a lot of people that supported him in this country did understand, is that when he was making this announcement, my first reaction was, regardless of what one may think with what the WHO did or didn't do, this is the exact opposite time to stop supporting them, not only for the coronavirus pandemic, but for some of the other things that we were just discussing. And I don't think that President Trump understands, or at least has not factored into his actions, the fact that when the world suffers from these things outside of the U.S.'s borders, it affects us in the United States. The same way with giving foreign aid to certain countries, military presence in other countries. He always simplifies it to say, well, what is the U.S. getting out of it? We're paying X number of days to protect them. He doesn't think about geopolitics, geostrategy, of how when there are less problems in certain areas of the world where we have U.S. interest, it helps the United States. So he doesn't even have to be altruistic. I just think he needs to understand that the WHO has done things that helped U.S. interests in ways that his base and a lot of Americans may not even understand.
All right, so then, Mary, I wanted to give you the final word, because it seems, and many people have made this argument, that if the U.S. were to walk away or even just suspend for now the funding as it's decided to, that other countries will have to fill in the vacuum, right? It's not like the rest of the world is just going to sit on their, sit down and just stay quiet. I mean, the WHO still has to function in some fashion, and it'll probably end up being the likes of China and others who will fill in that vacuum. And I would imagine that would make the United States, especially Donald Trump, quite unhappy. What are your thoughts about that?
I completely agree. I think it only makes sense that others will have to step up and, give more attention to the WHO. I think China will definitely fill that role. And I think that that's another thing that Trump is not considering or understanding. His criticism right now, and to a certain extent there's some fairness to the criticism. His criticism is that the WHO is China-centric. And, whether or not you believe that's true, certainly if China steps up and takes the role that previously the U.S. had been taking, surely then he must realize we'll have more control, we'll have more of a say. The U.S. will be out of the decision-making. And this makes no sense to me in any step. It seems like a bad move no matter how you look at it. And I just don't know how Trump can look at it over time and not understand that.
Very well. There that, but of course we appreciate both Mary and Calvin for their time this morning and for putting that all into context for us. This is an interesting issue, certainly, where Donald Trump this is not the first time, by the way, that he's gone after international organizations, but this time he's going after the WHO at a time when the rest of the world, and the entire world, including the U.S. really, is going through this coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19. Is this the time right now to be cutting funding? Sure, there are legitimate concerns about the WHO, which everyone really around the world has expressed possibly in some varying degrees. But is this the specific time to bring that up and to bring up these battles that the U.S. may have with how the WHO functions right now? Can this not be done after the COVID-19 pandemic is over, when we've all moved past that, and then we sit down and review exactly how the WHO acted at this time and what exactly needs to be reformed and fixed and how exactly to go about doing that? At this point in time, with the U.S. even suspending payments for a while, right in the middle of a pandemic, just doesn't make sense. The optics look bad, as well as just the realities on the ground. The fact is that if there are hotspots left anywhere in the world, that also endangers the U.S. homeland as well as the U.S. citizens themselves. So how really is this Trump putting America first? I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to still talk about the coronavirus pandemic around the world, but this time we're going to hone in on the United Kingdom, where the death toll now, what we've understood now, is truly exceeding the number that we've currently been given, according to the government. What's been published by the government, according to many, is not including those people who have died in care homes and or even just at home. So the numbers are potentially exponentially higher at this point in time, though we don't know exactly how much higher they are. How important is that or not in the grander scheme of things is certainly something that needs to be discussed. But we can also then, on top of that, just discuss the fact that the UK's fairly slow response to this pandemic, at least in the early days when this begun, is something worrying as well. And that's according to the country's former chief scientific advisor, Sir David King, who just recently said that the moment that this pandemic broke out in China itself, the UK should have acted immediately, because it was already understood by that point in time, especially by intelligence agencies, that this was going to spread globally potentially, and there should have been safeguards in place from the get-go. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Harry Fear, who is a journalist and filmmaker. He's joining us now from Oxford in the UK. Joining us from Reading in the UK is Mark Shanahan, who is Associate Professor and Head of Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading. Mark and Harry, thank you both for your time today. Mark, let me start with you. What do you make of how important it is for us to really have the true toll, be it just of infections or the death toll, really, in the UK?
I think it is really important. People have to see just how serious this is. And what we started off having the government announce was the number of deaths that had happened in hospital that had coronavirus as cause of death. And they do issue these on a daily basis, but that doesn't pick up, as you said, all of the ones that happen in care homes and in the wider population. And the Office for National Statistics is following on with these, but they pick up death certificates and what's reported on them. And that can be about a 5-day lag. So what we're actually seeing, people are saying this is approaching the peak. That may not be true at all, because we're not getting that wider and truer figure coming through. And also the ONS collects for England and Wales. We have separate figures coming in for Scotland and for Northern Ireland. And there is a little bit of a sense through the government communications that people are getting that we are at the peak or nearing the peak, and thus people are beginning to talk about easing the lockdown restrictions. We're too early for that. And now it's a delicate balance that the government has between life-saving decisions and economy-saving decisions. And which way that's going to go is still not clear at all.
What do you make then, Mark, of the criticism that Johnson has faced about how he reacted to this COVID-19 pandemic early on?
I think it's pretty justified, the criticism. Boris Johnson likes to be liked. He doesn't like to be seen to be the man giving the bad news and the really hard decisions. So he equivocated. He played the role of the good egg, the good guy in government, who thought that this would not be as serious as it might be. And by not giving the bad news sooner, by not implementing a fairly hard lockdown, his government could be accused of having caused a lot of deaths by not getting their act together around personal protection equipment, by not having the right resources in the right places in the National Health Service. This has made the UK curve go much steeper than countries, say, for instance, Germany or South Korea, that maybe we could be comparing with. They're similar-sized populations where they've had a much flatter curve. So when all of this is accounted after the event, the Conservative government under Boris Johnson is going to have a lot to answer for.
All right, so what are your thoughts about, A, how important the real death toll and even just the infection rate is, and B, how Johnson has really reacted to this pandemic altogether?
Johnson's been AWOL the last couple of weeks. Generally speaking, his response has been, I would say, insane, which is to think that British exceptionalism and some kind of arrogant, we're an island, we're going to have our own strategy kind of policy is going to be an appropriate response to a global health pandemic. In terms of the true figure, of course, from an accountability point of view, of course, from a point of truth and justice, we need to have the correct figure. However, I would say that, even several days ago, we already passed the point at which the number of Brits who died in hospitals was more than the total number of Brits killed in military conflict since the end of the Second World War. So we've already way past the threshold of what we would call a national catastrophe. And I think the focus has to be on accountability now in order to put the downward pressure on the curve that is the government's non-response. If we can see that there's a sort of a second curve on those timelines and graphs that we've been shown over the last couple of weeks, there's what amount of action has the government been taking? And it hasn't been a lot. And so we need to see a downward pressure on that as soon as possible in order to try and see a downward pressure on the number of infections and deaths, both in hospitals and in the community and care homes.
Okay, Mark, credit to Johnson. I'm going to try to play devil's advocate for a moment, just to be fair to him. Those Nightingale hospitals that have come up in major cities, that's something that he should be credited with, right? The decision he made to have those set up in those major auditoriums, et cetera. And B, the fact that he did seemingly, once he realized that this pandemic was actually serious, did seem to come in force, with the strict lockdown, which a lot of Britons do, according to polls, support, of course. It seems that, yes, there's a lot of Britons who do say that he should have acted a lot earlier, but do we not give him credit then for finally actually making the right moves?
He had to do something, obviously, but the Nightingale hospitals are fascinating. They have all of the gear, but they don't have the senior staff. So you have doctors in other ICUs, intensive care units across London, saying we have more patients than we have the capacity to deal with. Can we transfer them to the Nightingale at the Excel Centre in Docklands? And the Nightingale staff are coming back to them and saying, well, you can transfer the patients, but you've got to send the staff with them. So it's a political move. It looks good. It's a nice PR move. It's beyond PR, but it hasn't quite yet got the capability within the NHS behind it to make these hospitals, these temporary hospitals, fully effective. Now, what the government is trying to show that we have more capacity in the NHS than there is a need for, so that we're always ahead of the need to get people into hospital to deal with it. But what it's also exposed is the massive flaw we have in our social care system, which essentially means if you are in a care home, and we have hundreds of thousands of people across the country in a care home, and you get COVID-19, there is no means of these people being treated, brought into the National Health Service and getting better. So it's essentially, it is a certificate to die. That's not the kind of response that we should have had. It actually reflects not just this government, but several governments underinvesting in our national health and social care services across a period of most of the last 20 years. And that is what this is going to be exposing. So the NHS is the absolute darling that we hold up as one of the great totems of United Kingdom society. But what we're seeing is there's actually a pretty thin veneer there. There are absolutely brilliant people working across the service from all over the world, but government has never invested sufficiently for it to be the envy of the world.
Well, Harry, I read a statement by the Social Care Minister, Helen Whately. She told Sky News, and this statement came off to me as a bit tone deaf, but I mean, again, I don't have the entire quote. But she told Sky News that care homes are, quote unquote, used to infection control due to the seasonal flu, so they should simply be able to almost, I mean, I'm presuming the context and the, the implication there is that they should be able to sort of figure this out on their own. What do you make of that?
Look, the government's tone has been lacking, but we did vote for them in December. And the austerity background that has so much weakened the UK's health system, but not just the health system, also the organizational culture that says that we're going to have a small state, that we're not going to take responsibility for certain problems. Remember, the UN condemned the UK for the government's response to poverty. The UK is a very rich country, but there are institutional cultural issues that are at play now as we face this crisis and emergency. So yes, there is a background of austerity, but at the same time, there is still the active ideology of what government should be doing. And at this time of crisis, we're seeing the dark irony of how if you don't spend for the long term in an emergency, in a crisis, you end up flat on your face. So there's a cultural issue, and the governance system just isn't up to this crisis at the moment. The UK is quite happy to wage wars and various military adventures around the world, but when there's a crisis on our own island, we're actually not really up to the game. And the government know this, and they've known this for years because there have been already investigations and trials into emergency response, and they know that we were lacking. But because of the ideology, because of the culture, the governmental culture, they basically just ignored it. And so they're ignoring now the tragic reality and scale of what we're facing. And it's all of our jobs as citizens and part of the global citizenry, not just as journalists, but also as citizens, to shine a sharp light as rapidly as possible to get them to wake up to the fact that, no, actually now we are the war zone. We are the war zone, and the values have to change. The governance culture has to change. The Nightingale hospitals were not built off the ground. They were already exhibition centres. So the whole thing was a PR operation. And actually, they're not even close to capacity. The question about the care homes is, why are the elderly dying in care homes if the Nightingale pop-up hospitals have mass free beds? That's the question. And because there is no transparency at the moment, journalists are literally physically shut out of the Downing Street briefings. So there's no interrogation. Parliament isn't sitting. These basic questions are not being asked. The dots are not being connected and lives are not being saved.
So, Mark, I think post-COVID-19, that Johnson and others in government will reflect on what may have gone wrong. I mean, we are, of course, at a time where the UK is also now meant to be at least negotiating some sort of a deal with the EU, which it has decided to leave. That's a separate argument, of course, about whether that should have happened or not, but that is a reality now. Do you think that Johnson, because, it's right after Johnson came out of his own coronavirus, his own infection, he seemed to give, credit to, of course, a lot of those immigrants who did treat him in NHS. And that seemed to be, at least on the outside, again, for the optics of it, a change of heart. Is that promising, do you think, that he may actually fix things post-COVID-19?
I think I'd go back to what Harry was saying. It's about the ideology. That really, really does not suit the Conservative idea of small government, so that you have a small centralised force at the middle, that it effectively runs the country through the executive. And it does not provide huge funding for public services, whether that be councils, whether that be the NHS or whatever it may be. It would take quite a strong ideological shift. I don't think Boris Johnson is firmly fixed to an ideology. He is a pretty expedient politician, a fairly slippery politician. I suspect he will act on what he sees to be in the best interest in keeping his party in power for the longest possible time. We as a country will reflect, and we will be looking to see things differently. But we have to face up to the fact that in December, we elected a government with an 80-seat majority that is almost certainly going to be in place for the next nearly 5 years now. It depends really on whether the Conservatives want to stay in power beyond that 5 years, because we can't go back to the old norms. Do we stick to the economy of profit model that is there at the moment, that it's all about continual growth? That's going to be very difficult in the economic situation over the next 2-3 years, perhaps. So there will be some compromises, there will be some rebalancing, but I don't expect any fundamental change from a government that's looking to tie itself transatlantically to the Americans, that does seem to have turned its back on Europe, and is quite prepared to cut its nose off to spite its face in so doing.
There's an argument that's made a lot that we're being a bit too harsh on all of the above leaders, and we can include Donald Trump within that, of course, as in other global leaders as well, because this sort of caught everyone off guard, right? But then the argument, the other side is that, okay, the UK is, as you said as well, a rich nation, which should have had some sort of plan in place for such an emergency situation, to have something snap into place to an extent at least. Where do you lie within that? Because, I mean, we do have to be fair to the government, right? It's not like they would have seen something of this scale coming.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. Given the UK government and the American government's prevailing ideologies and their current ideologies, they're actually doing quite well by their own standards. But the issue, as we've already discussed in detail, is that the standards and the ideology is the problem. On the simple questions of whether or not these governments got the memo that there is a pandemic and that this is going to become a crisis and that drastic action is going to be needed, did they get the memo? Yes, they got the memos. They got the memos at least at the end of January, if not the beginning of January. And as you mentioned there in the introduction, we have intelligence agencies saying, well, China kept things secret from us. So the intelligence agencies obviously knew. So the information was available, but the question isn't whether it was available, it was why it wasn't listened to and what are the processes and cultures behind it not being listened to. So yeah, to be fair, within their own framework of values and culture, they're not doing that badly, although in America they are. In the UK, they're not doing that badly. But the issue is that the mindset is the problem. The issue is the mindset.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate both Harry and Mark for their time today and for giving us their insight on how the UK is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. We've spoken about this, of course, before as well, and I'm sure we'll speak about this in the coming days, but the true death toll is something which one needs to really have publicized to be able to understand really the scale of the issue in the UK and where exactly within this process of the virus the UK is at, what stage it's at, has it hit its peak or not. Those things cannot be understood till we have a clear picture of where exactly the virus is at right now. Care homes, as well as people who have died in their own homes, need to be taken into account. Are those Nightingale hospitals, as both of our guests there said, just a PR stunt? Are they not well staffed? All of those things are extremely important questions which need to be asked, which need to be discussed, which need to be tackled really, because it is the NHS which needs to be empowered at this point in time to be able to deal with this. And then, of course, after the fact, we all need to reflect on how the UK has acted at this time, whether or not Johnson did delay the most basic of lockdowns to fall into place at the right time. Had he acted at the right time, possibly he could have avoided this extent of the infection spreading in that country. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.